All right, welcome. So the first paper we're going to talk about um, is this paper titled "Better and Faster Large Language Models via Multi-Token Prediction." Uh, the good news is the math and the technical parts this week are going to be pretty light, so we can just talk a little bit about this. And at the end, I'll say a little bit why one of the reasons why I liked this paper. So the idea for this paper is that standard language models like Llama, GPT-3, they're trained, their core pre-training is done with just a basic cross-entropy loss on predicting the next token. So you say, the boy threw the, and then the model predicts what the next word is going to be, and depending on, from your training text, what the word actually is, um, it's if it's the word it's supposed to be, then it's going to try and bump the probability closer to one. And if it's any other word in the vocabulary, it's going to try and bump the probability closer to zero. So the concept in this paper is, what if we keep the main transformer body, but we just add multiple prediction heads? So for example, I'm going to predict the next token, the one after that, 3 tokens, and then the fourth token after that. And the simplest thing you can do is during inference, you take the additional prediction heads, you discard them, and you just pretend you trained this with regular next token prediction. So it doesn't really require very many changes from the way we train or use models for inference. And so one of the questions is, does the model train faster? Does it train better? And we'll see that the model does seem to perform better on more complex downstream tasks like coding and reasoning tasks. And then they also mentioned that there's this optional thing you can do where you don't discard the extra heads. You can actually use them for speculative decoding to speed up inference. So that's going to be the gist of things. And I'll go through this. I think this is a lighter paper, but if I'm going too fast, raise your hand, ask questions, slow me down. Okay, so let's talk about the method in a little more detail. So the idea is you have an LLM, maybe it has 24, 48 layers of transformers, all that stuff. The embedding of tokens into dense vectors, all of that stuff stays the same. The only difference is after the last transformer layer, where we normally have just one prediction head that predicts the next token, we could have two, we could have four. Theoretically, you can have whatever number, 8, whatever. Um, and in terms of what's the correct answer, that's usually pretty straightforward, right? You have some training text, you know what the next token is. You also know what the token after that is. And so you can just use the same cross entropy loss. Um, the goal for this particular paper was to try to do as much of a head-to-head comparison with with standard language models. And so their orientation was really like, if it's the same number of parameters, does this model do better? I think another way they could have come at it was just more sort of like architecturally, is this an interesting choice? Okay. Um, and so when they did things, basically they said, hey, you know what? We're actually adding more parameters when we add these prediction heads. So in order to do a fair comparison to a model that only does next token prediction, I'm actually going to I'm going to make the main body a tiny bit smaller in order to make it apples to apples. I think it's a very reasonable, it's a good fair choice, but I also feel like, maybe if you didn't do that and you just added more prediction heads, you could sort of measure more directly, like how much does just changing the prediction heads help things. So I'm going to just back up a little bit. I think many of you have seen some of these slides and you're familiar with these concepts, but when we talk about like the main body being unchanged, so here's our transformer from the original attention is all you need paper. And in something like Llama, we're doing decoder only. So that means that we don't use the part on the left and we don't have this cross attention. If I redraw this thing, okay, then it looks like this, where I've now emphasized the residual connection is the straight line, instead of the it being a little bit harder to see with sort of like these loopy connections. So if we take this and we repeat it at multiple token positions and we repeat it for multiple layers, then basically this is what our standard LLM looks like. Okay, you've got multiple tokens left to right, and you've got a whole bunch of layers here. The pink at the bottom is where you embed tokens, and then at the top you have a linear layer that does the unembedding, and then a softmax just to say, which tokens are the highest probability. So what they're talking about in this paper is just changing this very top part. This is the only architecture change, where now instead of having one linear layer, let's say you're predicting the next 4 tokens, you're going to have 4 of these. And if I go back and forth, maybe it's a bit of an eye chart, but maybe you can actually see like there's 4 blue boxes, 4 green boxes. But so that's the idea, is they're trying to make a fairly minimal change here and see, does it have any impacts? And it turns out it does have impacts. One thing that I thought was very cool, because I've actually thought about this multi-token prediction, and I hadn't really thought about the fact that normally when you train a neural network, whether it's a language model or any other model, what you do is you do your entire forward pass. You do it over the entire model, everything in the entire network. And PyTorch, TensorFlow, whatever, what they're going to do is they're going to use a lot of memory, and they're going to store information to keep track of all the gradients so that they can do the backward pass. But one thing about prediction heads is that if your model dimension, like your residual stream, is say 8,000, so you have 8,000 floats there. But if your vocabulary size is, some of these bigger models are now like say 80,000, okay? Each unembedding matrix would then be 8,000 by 80,000. So I don't know what's the math on that, but like it's like 6 billion. I don't know, but it's a lot of floats, and so it's going to take up a lot of memory keeping track of the gradients on something that size. So they do this little bit of a trick where they don't actually do the forward pass all at once. What they do, if you look at the diagram on the right, this is just showing 2, but you can do it for 4, you can do it for however many, is when they do the forward pass on one particular prediction head, they then do a mini backward pass just on that one head and nothing else. So the main trunk, that's all the transformers and everything, they're not doing anything. And where this little gray circle is, they're just accumulating the gradients from the multiple prediction heads. And then after the last prediction head, the backward pass works perfectly normally, just like usual. But what that means is if you do head 1 and you do this mini backward part, then you don't have to keep any more memory. You can throw away everything about head 1. And so when they're doing 8 or more prediction heads, this is pretty cool. So fundamentally doesn't really change the idea, but it does mean that like for running it on a GPU without bloating how much GPU memory you need, it is a handy little trick. So I liked that trick. I haven't really seen that elsewhere. I don't know if other people do similar things. All right, so what are the results? They tried training some small to medium-sized language models from 300 million to 13 billion parameters. These are not tiny, but they're not like state-of-the-art. And interesting, the multi-token prediction did a lot better on the big models, but it actually did worse on the small models. And you can see on these charts that it's kind of a consistent trend that the bigger you get, the better it does. The authors in the paper didn't have too many comments on this, but I have a hypothesis, which is that in the smaller models that have smaller parameters, they're smaller in every way. They have fewer layers, okay? But one of the ways is the model dimension, the residual stream, is smaller. And I think that you can be sort of like smarter about thinking ahead if you do multi-token prediction, but you also need storage capacity to store the information if you're thinking ahead. Just like if you're thinking of something to say, or if you're doing a math problem, you can think multiple steps ahead, but somewhere you have to be sort of storing the fact that you're thinking about intermediate things. And so I think that actually the residual stream is just too narrow on these really small models. And that's why they do worse. So I personally would be interested in seeing a small model with a wider residual stream to see if it actually does better. Now, admittedly, when you increase that model dimension, you do increase the number of parameters. You do increase the amount of compute you need. So like it's not necessarily a free lunch kind of a situation. But nevertheless, I do think that that would be an interesting thing to, in order to say, is the fundamental issue that you need to be big, or is the fundamental issue that you just need enough storage space in your residual stream to, you know, um, keep track of multiple token concepts? All right, what are some of the other results? Um, so they said, so we think that this is better, like the more you need to think about the future. And so they came up with this experiment where they said instead of tokenizing things the way we normally do, um, so normally you would have like very common words would just be a single token. And then yes, we do use like word pieces or whatever, but they said, nope, nope, we're just gonna break everything into 1 byte at a time. And so this is going to force lots of text to be spread out over more tokens than they were before. And since you're only doing 1 token at a time normally, this means that you really need to be thinking further out. And sure enough, what happened when they did this is that the gains from doing multi-byte prediction were much larger than for a regular model. So it's like the more your data depended on you thinking ahead, the better it seemed to do. For regular English text, regular tokens, it seemed like 4 tokens was the best, but they said that, hey, this probably depends on data. So like you need more tokens, more thinking ahead if you're doing coding, for example, probably less if you're doing some like fact recall. What's the capital of Paris? You know, what's the capital of France? You don't really need, you know, a whole lot of tokens. And they also tried it out and said, yep, this still works even if you train over your data set for multiple epochs. One of the things that I liked is they said, okay, those were some results for just the pre-trained model, but most people don't use the pre-trained model. Some people do, zero shot, few shot, but a lot of people want to fine tune it. So let's try fine tuning. And they said, yep, still works better on code tasks after fine tuning. So you can do a regular model fine tuned. You can do our model fine tuning with just next token prediction, or you can change the fine tuning as well. And so you can say I pre-trained it using 4 token prediction and I fine tuned it using 4 token prediction, and both variants ended up beating the single token prediction. A lot of that was studied on code, which again is like more complex, needs more planning maybe. So he said, what about regular NLP? Interestingly, on some of the old benchmarks, MMLU, that type of stuff, um, the the 4 token prediction actually did worse now than the regular. Um, and this is where, again, I think that perhaps because they're allocating more parameters to these extra prediction heads, um, that caused them to shrink the main model, and that's why. So again, I'm not saying it would be a completely fair comparison, but I would be interested to see if you just left the model the same and you added the extra prediction heads. It really shouldn't do worse, I don't think, but it could. And so for me, that would be very interesting to see. Is it something fundamental to the way it learns? Or is it just, no, the reason it did worse is because it doesn't need, like, again, if you're asking it, what's the capital of France? It doesn't need those extra prediction heads, and you've now just stolen all those parameters from the main model. They tried different tasks that they thought might, you know, require a little bit more planning. And so they did text summarization. They did a bunch of benchmarks that use the Rouge metric. If you guys are familiar with Rouge, or if you've heard me talk about it, it's not my favorite metric. Um, it's not it's not terribly accurate. It's not even clear it's measuring the right thing because it's basically comparing exact word matches, string matches to human written summaries. And maybe some of the human written summaries aren't perfect, or maybe some of the computer summaries are just as good, even though they don't use the same words. But it's been well studied, and so it's fair to compare it to a bunch of other models. And so, unlike the simpler metrics, for summarization, they found next token prediction wins, and the more they train it, the more the 4 tokens beats the 2 tokens ahead. Next couple things they tried are sort of these like synthetic tests to like kind of peer under the hood a little bit. And so I liked this one. This one was kind of interesting. They trained the model to do some generative tasks with children's stories. But what they did is they swapped out the names of the characters in the story with random names that they just slapped in there. But in particular, what they did is they made sure that all the names were 2 tokens in whatever the tokenization scheme the model used. So if say whatever Jonathan is a 2 token name, then when you say, whatever the witch, gave the food to, and then the next token is going to be the first half of Jonathan, you need a whole lot of sentence context in order to predict what that token's going to be. But when you see the first half of Jonathan, let's say it's John, then it's very easy to say, oh, well, now that I've seen John, like the Uffen second half of the name is super likely. Okay. And so this pattern of I've seen the first half and the second half before, now I've seen the first half, I'm going to bump up the probability of the second half. That's what now people call an induction head. Okay, so if you hear people talk about induction heads, skip trigrams, that's the thing where you see A, B, now you see A again, and you're going to bump up the probability of B. So what they found is that, yeah, when they did 2 token prediction instead of 1 token prediction, that these induction heads formed much earlier in the training, and they formed for very small models. And so basically what they're saying is that this is the kind of thing that you want long term. You want induction heads. You want models to be able to do good reasoning. And so that's perhaps part of the explanation why this helps. Another thing they tested on was these kind of math problems. So you say, oh, if I do subtraction, division, a polynomial, 2x squared minus 3x plus 4, predict what that answer is on this ring, then training it with just normal next token prediction, they were able to beat it using multi-token prediction. And they also said, even though the results overall are fairly poor, that it also did better when, like, I trained it on just a bunch of multiplication addition problems, and now I'm going to test it on something else that's out of domain. I'm going to test it on a division problem. So that's where you see here on the right is the out of domain, where these things were only trained up to 5 operations. But if they actually gave it more, 6, 7, 8, the multi-token did better. So it's a bunch of different experiments, all just to say that this is an interesting thing. And maybe if you want to do hard tasks, like reasoning tasks, like math proofs, complex chain of thought decision making, then maybe multi-token prediction is the way to go for training our models. So then one last thing I want to mention that they talked about is this idea of faster inference. I added one slide at the end if we want. If people are not familiar, we can talk about speculative decoding. But the idea here is that when you predict 4 tokens ahead, they might be the actual right second, third, and fourth tokens. They might not. But so you can use speculative decoding, and you can say, let me just read those out and actually verify whether or not they are. And if they are, then basically that saves you from having to do another full inference pass in order to get that token. So in order for speculative decoding to work, for it to help, what you need is you need a pretty high hit rate. And so what they said is when they trained it on code, they found that about predicting 4 tokens ahead, that about 2.5 out of every 3 of the suggestions were in fact the correct next token. So that's pretty helpful. When they ran it on text, it was even better. It was 2.7 out of the 3 tokens that they predicted ahead were in fact the right tokens. So this next token prediction is in fact not only sending additional training signal during training, it's actually doing a pretty decent job of being right a lot of the time. All right, so to kind of wrap this up, again, they kept things as similar as possible, but they just trained multiple tokens, mostly for text, either 2 or 4 tokens ahead, instead of just predicting the next token. In the appendix, they mentioned they tried some other variants instead of just doing them in parallel. So you could have said, I'm going to predict the next token, and I'm going to predict the one 2 ahead, not just based on the base transformer, but the base transformer plus knowing what my next token prediction is. And then the third one would know not just the base, but also what the first 2. Interestingly enough, they also tried something that was the reversed. So it's I'm going to predict the 4th token ahead, and then using that, I'll predict the 3rd. Using that combined info, I'll predict the 2nd. And now, and I kind of like this idea. I'd like to see a little more research. Now, knowing everything I know from my main transformer, and knowing a little bit of like oracle information about what might be happening, not just in the next token, but 2, 3, 4 tokens down the line, do I want to bump up or down my next token prediction a little bit? I don't think they really pursued them too much, but I think it would be interesting to see. I think there are some potential interesting edge cases, like for alignment, to get the model to not just, to correct things, but to behave a particular way. Then maybe this reverse, what they call anti-causal multi-token prediction, would help it to sort of say like, yeah, like let's not, if you're trying to avoid like being rude or something like that, like actually thinking farther ahead might actually be helpful. I didn't really talk about, there was a little bit in the paper where they speculate about like why, does this work? Certainly there's the earlier induction heads, but another thing they talked about that I thought hadn't really thought about is when you train the models, they use this thing called teacher forcing. Okay. So you give the model the boy through the, okay, and you're predicting what the next word is going to be. And if you predict the next word is sunspot, but the actual next word was ball, then it doesn't matter. Basically, what they're doing is they're saying, I'm going to give you ball and have you predict the word after ball. They don't in any way say, okay, predict what the next word after that would be if you in fact used sunspot as the next word. Okay, so that's what they call teacher forcing, and they say that with teacher forcing, uh, this is not the right way to say it, but less technically, it can be a little bit of a crutch because, like, you don't have to do that great because it's always sort of correcting you after each word and making sure that you don't, So if like you were driving, and you were only predicting the action to do the next 1/10 second, but no matter what you did, in training, it always put you right back in the center of the lane. Like you could imagine, maybe there'd be some perverse behaviors you would learn because you never actually swerved off the road and crashed because the teacher forcing always kept you right there, right? So they're saying that that's a bit of a domain shift between training and actual inference time. And so they think that this longer signal maybe helps correct that domain shift there. So I thought that was an interesting hypothesis. So ultimately, they said it worked better for larger models. Their largest model was 13 billion. I can certainly understand that is not small. It takes quite a bit of compute to train these language models. But I'm hoping someone will follow up on it because I think that with their results where it just kept getting better, then theoretically a 70 billion model or some equivalent super condensed, mixture of experts version of it or whatever, it seems to me like if that was the trend, then maybe the gains are even more. Um, and the authors mentioned that perhaps the way we've optimized the size of our LLMs is all based on this one way that we train them. So if we actually had multi-token be the standard thing, maybe vocabulary size would be different. Maybe the vocabulary would be smaller, for example. I'm going to throw out there, like I've said before, that I'd like to see expanded model dimensions. Um, it's just not clear that, oh, for a 7 billion model, you should use a residual stream that's 2,000. Well, maybe 3 or 4,000 would actually work better. So that's this paper. I've got I'll post the slides later. A couple references. So this is first reference is the speculative decoding. And then if you want to learn more about induction heads, there's all this wonderful work from Anthropic. At this point, it's like a couple years old, but the early stuff that they did really great stuff with CNNs in their first circuits thing, and then they did transformer circuits. It was about 2 years ago when they did the first really great results looking at attention. All right, so I can talk about speculative decoding at the end if you want, but I'm gonna pause here for questions and then turn things over to Ryan. Any questions? All right, cool.
I think for me, the interesting part was I think one aspect is getting a better model, but then the interesting aspect to me was you get that built-in speculative decoding. That was the thing that I saw a lot of people discussing on LinkedIn and stuff. I just think that's an interesting ability because what a lot of people are doing now is they take some external small model and they say,
Yeah.
I'm gonna speculative, make some predictions, but this has a whole thing built in. And in theory, that's going to be a stronger speculative decoding model than whatever little thing you put in front of it.
Yeah, you could do speculative decoding with an external big model or whatever, but then it's expensive. So that's why they use the small models, is they want it to be cheap, but then to your point, the small models maybe are inherently like dumber or whatever. The other thing I'll say, I wanted to squeeze this in, sorry, Ryan. One
Go for
more
it. Yeah.
point, but just the last 3 years, we've seen so many advances with just iterating on whatever the current hot thing is. So with LLMs, and then once like the first diffusion models came out, it's like, let me just do a slight iteration on this. Let me just take transformers that worked for LLMs and throw them in vision. Now I've got VIT. Now let me throw them in video. And now, and so I feel like it's either some combination of there hasn't been a lot of encouragement for people to try different things because you're getting new state-of-the-art results just if you just go down the beaten path, right? It's some combination of that and just like the hype, the interest, the amount that things go viral on Twitter, right? Was sort of along those lines. So that has slowed down. Some of that is due to companies now not releasing as much of their stuff because they want to make money. Some people are feeling that like we actually are a little bit hitting a wall with what can be done with language models. Maybe it's because we're running out of data. Maybe it's because of whatever, training costs. So I feel like Mamba came out like in December, late November, um, and there was a lot of interest in that. Um, People have been talking about these cans, the Kolmogorov-Arnold networks. This is more of an iteration, less of a real like change, but I do feel like um, it'll be nice to see people trying more different things uh, once again, and it could be for like the various different reasons, but I think we've proved with something that works pretty well, transformers, that you can get really great results if you scale them. Now I think a lot of people are more focused to say like, yeah, transformers are great, but it gets really expensive once you get big. So let's look at other options because if some we know it can work well, now can we find something cheaper? Because if we can find something cheaper and then scale it the same, then we're really, really in great shape. So I think that's why we're starting to see either more actual research, or maybe there always was the research, it just didn't get the attention, more attention on those kinds of things.
Yeah, lots of stuff popping up. All right, I will swap over, present on this separate paper. So I'll be talking about RemoteCLIP. Um, I've always been interested in all of the satellite imagery stuff, and this was kind of just an excuse to dig into some of the data sets and some of the interesting stuff that's been going on with that. Um, so just at a high level, what is this paper about? So we've got all of these strong foundational models for computer vision, um, and a lot of them have been trained on ImageNet or other various sources. So we have tons and tons of images. We built strong computer vision models. Um, and we have this other domain, satellite imagery, where we have an insane amount of data, like orders of magnitude more than anything else. We're taking ultra high resolution pictures of the Earth every 10 minutes in all of these different wavelengths. And it's just like a ridiculously huge pile of data. And it doesn't seem like it's been there's plenty of companies that are looking at it, but in terms of the research, I think it's been kind of understudied probably in reference to our regular like camera pictures. Um, so what this paper is doing is trying to find a way to use this wealth of data to build a strong model for these specific applications. So throughout the paper, they actually looked at existing models and then they said, how do we improve upon this for this specific domain? Um, so a little bit of background. In the past, we've talked about the CLIP model a little bit. So this came from OpenAI. And basically what they did is they took images and then they took the corresponding like alt text metadata stuff. So you might see that on Wikipedia. You see a picture and then you see like the text that's underneath it describing what's in the image. And they basically said, let's just scoop all of that up from the internet and then train a model in order to understand both of those pieces together and understand how they fit. So the actual architecture behind that model is you have one vision tower that says, I'm going to take this image, I'm going to make an embedding out of it, and then you have the corresponding text, and then you say, I'm going to make an embedding out of that, and in theory, you want them to be close to each other. Um, and so there's a bunch of training tricks in order to make that actually work, but that's the gist of it. Is you have vision encoder, text encoder, and then you want them to create encodings that are close by to each other. Um, and so another thing that they were looking at in this paper was masked image modeling. So that's actually something that we've talked about in the past too. So it's this idea that you take some image and then you punch some holes in it, and then you train the model to try and fill in the blanks. So you say, I'm gonna occlude the part where the tail of the cat is, and then you're going to try and draw in the tail of the cat again. Um, and this has been shown to be a strong technique, but they were kind of making the argument that this isn't good enough for the kinds of things that they want to do with satellite imagery because it doesn't get the kind of features that they want. Um, so the first problem that they ran into and wanted to tackle was that there's tons and tons of this data, but not very much of it is labeled. We're just taking these images and then storing them, and then no one is manually looking at them and saying, I'm going to trace out all the trees and roads and everything. So they had to figure out how to get around that. So we have this huge pile of data, but we don't actually have the labels for something to train. We don't have the same like alt text for every square of the earth, basically. Um, and so what they started off with is taking all of the different data sets that have already been labeled in various different ways. So the start of it is like, here's everything we have. Let's just gather all of that up. And now we have 12 data sets concatenated together instead of just each individually not being very much. Um, and so they trained the model against that. And the first thing that they found was that they got the pattern that you expect, where you say bigger model, more performance, more layers, all of that stuff. But then they found that if they actually scaled it up to the huge sizes that a lot of the other CLIP models were trained to, you got to sort of a point where bigger model yielded worse performance because it just had so many parameters and not enough data to actually fill out all of those parameters. Um, and so they had to search for additional pools of data. So all of this was satellite imagery stuff, and they actually found that they could get good value out of expanding this to UAV data sets. So it's not the same thing as coming from a satellite, but you still have that sort of aerial view of the Earth. And so you might have slightly different scale, you might have different wavelengths that you're looking at. Um, but they can still get similar looking data, sort of. So the second thing that they ran into was with all of those different data sets, they're labeling for different things, they're in different formats, and so they had to kind of find some combined representation of them. So some of the data sets were segmentation. So for a certain image, every single pixel, is it vegetation? Is it road? Is it tennis court? Is it whatever? Um, and so that's one format of it. And then they also have object detection where they say, I'm going to draw a bounding box around every single building or something like that. And so they have these two different representations. That's kind of the majority of the data that they have available to them. And they had to figure out some way in order to make these common and then also map that down to the caption format similar to the clip stuff. So like I was talking about, you have the image and then you have the corresponding text representation. You need some text representation rather than bounding boxes and segmentation maps. And so you have to kind of figure out how do we turn that um, into the correct kind of caption format. So they made this mask to box transformation, and then they also made a second layer box to caption, and I'll show some pictures of that on the next slide. Um, so this is showing an example of some of the segmentations. So you can see red is some class, blue is some class, and then green is some other class. And what they figured out that they can do is they can go from segmentation map down to bounding boxes and say, give us the rectangle that corresponds to this bounding box. And then from there, from these bounding boxes, they can turn this into some sort of description of what is in there. So it goes all the way from segmentation map to boxes to captions. And so down here it says a large deal of places with cars are in the middle of the picture. And so they kind of created this rule set that just says basically when there's certain criteria, phrase it in a certain way. So like you can see there's all of these little blue cars or whatever they're marking here. And so that got converted to say a large deal of places with cars. Um, and so it's not quite perfect, but it's good enough that you can kind of convert all of these things down and get captions that are semi-reasonable, explaining the position and the quantity and the kinds of things that are in the picture. And so they had to do this for 12 different data sets, some of them starting from segmentation, some of them starting from detection. So there's a lot of these detection data sets where they already started with bounding boxes. So all they had to do was the box to caption. They didn't have to do the mask to box. Um, and so here's kind of the collection of all of their different data sets. They also have some retrieval data sets. And what these are trying to do is you want to give it some text and then you want to return all of the images that correspond to that sort of criteria. And that's kind of a difficult task because you might say return all the images that have planes in them. And then you have to hope that your encoder is able to get close to the embeddings of all of the images that have planes in them. Um, and so they tweak this to look at a bunch of different fine-tuned tasks after that. So we'll look at that for a little bit. So one of the things that they did is we have all of these different data sets and they wanted to visualize like what is actually captured inside of these data sets. So they made these word maps of them showing in this data set, here's the kinds of things that we're looking at. So you can see there's a lot of residential area, straight runway, parking lot. So each of the data sets is kind of covering different things. And you can see the frequencies and how that differs between all of them. They also did some t-SNE plots. So they ran this on all the data sets, and you can actually see that they all kind of cluster among themselves, which is kind of interesting. So the images must be looking at slightly different topics, and you can see that they're mapping to different regions. And then they also did some further analysis looking at the breakdowns of the objects that are in there. So they excluded all of those kind of um, fluff words, and they just said, okay, how many of these have cars in them? How many of them have pedestrians? And you can see how that breaks down, and then you can see what some of the images look like from the data sets that they were looking at. Um, so the results, they got state of the art on a whole bunch of different benchmarks. So they tried it on a lot of these different data sets. Um, they did it for retrieval, like I mentioned earlier. They did it on zero-shot image classification. They did few-shot classification, and they also created a new data set for counting. So they made this remote count data set, and basically what it was they went through and they grabbed some images, and then they said, let's just actually count the image, the instances that are in here. So if you want to say like there are 8 cars in this image, that's what that data set represents, is a bunch of different classes and then the counts of the objects in there. And so they wanted to see how good is this model at actually just counting things, because that's a really common task and not typically done with other models. Um, but in terms of satellite imagery, that's like one of the top things. It's not, is there one of these? It's how many of them are there? You want to count a bunch of assets or whatever's going on out there. So here's a big table showing the retrieval performance. So the red is showing the previous state of the art, and the blue is showing theirs. And so this is showing they're using the combination of all of these different data sets. They have order of magnitude larger set of images than anything else, and you can see that they have a big increase in performance across a lot of these. So looking at the recall, um, they're the model's favorite top one recommendation, very often significantly better. Top 5, top 10, you can see that it's got a big advantage on all of these actually. And so they benchmarked it across these 3 different data sets. You can see that it performs favorably on all of them. And some of them it's impressively slow, impressively good, like twice as good. So like on these, you can see it's the top one only 10% of the time it was getting the correct recall, and now it's getting significantly better. So it's not amazing performance, but in terms of like recall at top one, that's a significant jump. Um, so another thing that they did was zero-shot classification, and they compared this across various different backbones and various different tasks. Um, and they found that it performed favorably. So one of the benchmarks that they were continuously going against was the original clip. So the advantage of the original clip is it had that massive set of potentially billions of images that have their image and their alt text mapping. Um, and the remote clip has such a smaller set of images because they only have those images and the bounding boxes and segmentation maps. But you can tell that just because it's in the correct domain, it's performing actually favorably. So in certain data sets, it performs worse, but across the board in general, it performs better than the original clip, despite having much less data. Because it's in the correct domain, it still performs significantly better. So here's showing part of their remote count data set. So they basically give it the prompt a photo of, and then they want it to return back the count of the number of objects, for example. So you can see it's counting tennis courts and soccer fields and swimming pools and baseball diamonds, and some of these are actually quite granular when you consider that this is only like a tiny little image and it's trying to find all of these little objects. So it does a pretty impressively good job. Um, Down here, you can see the performance of the original clip versus their new remote clip. And you can see that because it was kind of trained with that in the captions in mind, it does significantly better across all of these different ranges of top 1 through 10. Um, So they tried it in two different ways. It ultimately didn't seem to make a difference, but just the representation of like nine, the number nine versus the word nine, Nine, they were measuring the difference in that. And so they were seeing that the remote clip is robust to that. And for some reason on regular clip, there's a gap in performance there. So another thing that they tried was few shot classification. So before they were doing zero shot classification, where they were basically saying just give it a new class. How is it at figuring out what that new thing is? You hope that the text encoder is strong enough to understand new words and then map that to the different things that you're looking for. But the few shot, what they did is they gave it a few examples, so between 1 and 32, and then they said, let's train a very small layer on top of this and say, how does it actually perform at this task? So this is a good test saying basically how good of an embedding is it outputting that can then be tuned to do these various different tasks. And you can see that actually, when you only give it one sample, it does worse than zero shot because you're kind of at the mercy of whichever one you randomly give the model. But once you get to 4, 8, 16, 32, you're significantly beating the performance of the zero shot. So in this case, you just give it 32 labeled examples and then you say fine tune it for that specific thing, and it gives you a really good performance at that given task. And so they show that they create a big gap even over clip, even though clip's seen way more data. So another similar thing, they do linear probing. So this is like they did zero shot, few shot, and then this is like give it the full data set and then just see how it does. And so they showed that this performs favorably in some tasks and unfavorably in others. And they had kind of the hypothesis that maybe it was bad because some of these things were in different resolutions. And so the granularity might have been off. Um, but in general, it performs well across the board. It's just a matter of certain data sets. It seems to do suspiciously bad. So they did various ablations just to understand what is like the significant factor here. So they tried different backbones and they also tried different um, kind of core data sets and training methods. And so you can see um, this I don't know, VITAE is another method that people have been using for the satellite imagery stuff. And so they were showing here using all of these different objectives, we can see that clip is actually yielding the strongest at what we're interested in. Um, and then they also tried um, the what was important. So taking an image pre-training, taking a text pre-training, turning that on and off. And so they were able to show that both of these are actually very important. So if you turn off the image pre-training, you end up with a very weak image model that doesn't end up mapping very well. And similar thing, if you don't start with the text pre-training, then its text understanding is not very good. And so you have to start with kind of a pre-trained text and then pre-trained vision, and then you combine them, and then you continue training um, on the satellite imagery. And then they also showed the performance given all of the different combinations of data sets that they could do. So they have the segmentation set, the detection set, and the retrieval set, and then they can say, how does it do at these various different things when we only train it on one or the other or a combination of them. And so they found that turning all three of them on was the best thing to do. Um, One of the interesting bits here is they did some rotation augmentation and they tried various different things. And my honest conclusion from this is that the augmentations didn't matter because if you look at the no augmentation, it does even better than the zero shot. And it does a tiny bit better on the retrieval when they do the rotation, but it's a small enough difference that I'm not sure if it's really significant. One of the things that I kind of question is um, in their captioning, it has some positional information, and I'm not sure if it's entirely valid when you do the rotations. So they might have had an issue where they rotated the image, but they didn't update the caption, so then the caption ended up incorrect. So just one thing that might be worth evaluating. Um, so they tried the various different loss functions and they found that this info NCE was the most powerful. I've seen a lot of discussion about the SIGLIP method recently. A bunch of people have been using that and then injecting that into their multimodal LLM models, and that seems to be the best option. But it's interesting that this other loss function is turning up so favorably. Um, yeah, that's everything I have. Any questions?
Quick question, Ryan. Um, there was the counting test. Uh, do you know, did the captions include counts? Because like the one you showed just said like a whole bunch of cars. So like I was curious whether or not it really was trained on specific numbers or not.
It was. So the way they structured it was it would give the actual counts of the objects up until 10, and then beyond that it would just say many or a bunch or lots
Okay.
of or something like that. Yeah. So it they only did 0 to 10, but
Yeah.
that's how they structured things. Yeah. It
Okay.
was trained. Yeah.
That's cool. That sounds like a whole lot of work to corral all this data before you even got to start training.
Um, there's a question about clip or remote clip as a labeler. They didn't use it in that way on this, but that might be a further work. Now that they have the model, they can use it as a labeling tool.
All right. Thanks.